The lawyer said my father left me nothing. My uncle smiled across the mahogany desk, holding papers that gave him everything: the company, the estate, the fortune. But what he didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for 5 years, and his smile was about to disappear forever. The leather chair in Marcus Sterling's law office was designed to intimidate. High-backed, black, positioned across from his massive desk like you were already on trial. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, while my Uncle Richard paced behind me like a shark circling wounded prey. "Shall we begin?" Marcus adjusted his reading glasses, the kind that cost more than most people's cars. The kind that said every word out of his mouth would be expensive. Around the room, my family had positioned themselves like chess pieces. Aunt Caroline by the window, her Chanel suit pristine as always. My cousins David and Michelle on the leather sofa, trying to look somber but failing to hide their anticipation. And Richard, my father's younger brother, standing behind me close enough that I could smell his Tom Ford cologne. The same cologne he'd worn to the hospital the day my father died. "The last will and testament of Jonathan Pierce," Marcus began, his voice carrying the practiced solemnity of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. "Written and executed on March 15, 2019. I did the math quickly. March 15th, 2 months before my father's stroke, 2 months before he had stopped recognizing my face. 2 months before he'd become the shell in the hospital bed who couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't tell me what he really wanted. "To my beloved daughter, Emma," Marcus continued, and the room went silent. This was it. The moment they had all been waiting for. I leave my personal effects, photographs, and the sum of $50,000. The words hung in the air like smoke from a gun. $50,000. My father's estate was worth $87 million. The company he'd built from nothing was valued at over $200 million. The real estate portfolio alone could fund a small country. And I got $50,000 and some photographs. The remainder of the estate, Marcus's voice cut through my shock, including controlling interest in Pierce Industries, all properties, investments, and assets, I leave to my brother Richard Pierce, trusting him to manage everything according to the family's best interests. Richard's hand landed on my shoulder, heavy, possessive, victorious. "I'm so sorry, Emma," he said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "Your father wanted you taken care of, but he knew you weren't ready for this responsibility." I looked up at him, at his perfect silver hair, his custom suit, his smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I smiled back. Because what none of them knew, what Richard couldn't possibly know, was that I'd been ready for exactly this moment for 5 years. 5 years ago, my father called me into his study at midnight. That alone should have told me something was wrong. Jonathan Pierce didn't do midnight conversations. He did breakfast meetings, lunch negotiations, and dinner deals. Midnight was for emergencies. "Close the door," he said, and I noticed his hand shaking as he poured whiskey into 2 glasses. He had never offered me whiskey before. "Dad, what's going on?" He slid a folder across his desk. Medical reports. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer. 6 months, maybe 8 if he was lucky. I don't remember sitting down, but suddenly I was in the chair across from him, the same chair where he'd taught me to read financial statements when I was 12, where we'd planned my business degree, where he'd told me I'd run Pierce Industries someday. "There's something else," he said, his voice steady despite the death sentence on paper between us. "Richard's been asking questions about my will, about succession plans, about power of attorney. He's your brother," I said, not understanding yet. "He's probably just worried about you." My father laughed, bitter and sharp. "Richard's worried about himself. He's always been worried about himself." He pulled out another folder, this one thicker. "I've been reviewing documents, financial records. Things don't add up, Emma. Money's moving in ways it shouldn't. Over the next 3 weeks, my father showed me everything. Accounts that had been opened in his name that he didn't remember authorizing. Transfers to shell companies. Signatures that looked like his but weren't quite right, and Richard's fingerprints on all of it. "Why don't you confront him?" I asked. "Because I need proof that will hold up in court," he said. And because he stopped, pain crossing his face. Not physical pain, something worse. Because he's my brother, and I want to be wrong. But he wasn't wrong. 2 months later, my father had his stroke. I was at the hospital when Richard arrived with a lawyer I'd never seen before. They went into my father's room when he was alone, barely conscious. 30 minutes later, they emerged with signed documents. I knew then. Watching Richard's satisfied smile, watching the lawyer pack away papers, watching my father's life being stolen while he lay helpless. That night, I opened a bank account under a business name Richard would never connect to me. I deposited my entire savings, $14,000, everything I had. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and I made myself a promise. Richard wouldn't just lose what he was stealing. He'd lose everything he already had. I would make sure of it. The war had begun. He just didn't know it yet. The first thing I learned about revenge is that it requires patience. The second thing is that it requires evidence. Lots of it. I became a ghost in my own life. To everyone watching, I was the grieving daughter, lost and overwhelmed, spending my days at the hospital holding my father's hand while he slowly faded. They saw what they expected to see. A 23-year-old girl crying in hospital corridors, too emotional to think straight. What they didn't see was the smartphone in my purse, recording every conversation. What they didn't see were the photos I took of documents when Richard's lawyer left his briefcase unattended. What they didn't see was me befriending nurses, orderlies, anyone who might have witnessed those 30 minutes in my father's hospital room. "Your uncle really cares about your father," one nurse told me, not knowing she was handing me gold. "He's been visiting for months, always bringing documents for your dad to sign. So dedicated. Months, not weeks. Months before the stroke." I smiled and thanked her and added her testimony to the growing file I kept in a storage unit across town. The storage unit Richard didn't know existed. The one I paid for in cash. At night, I taught myself corporate law. Not from expensive courses, I couldn't afford those. From free online lectures, library books, legal forums where lawyers discussed cases. I learned about fraud, about undue influence, about what made a will contestable in court. But I also learned something else. Court cases take years. They cost millions. They destroy families publicly. And even if you win, you only get back what was taken. You don't get justice. I wanted more than that. So I started looking at Richard's business. Really looking. Pierce Industries was successful, but Richard had his own investments. Real estate, tech, startups, import-export companies. All the side ventures he thought my father didn't notice. I noticed, and I started to see the patterns, the vulnerabilities, the pressure points. My father died 3 months after his stroke. I cried at the funeral. Real tears, because I had lost him, but also because Richard put his arm around me during the service, whispered, "We'll get through this together," while his lawyer stood 10 feet away with the forged will in his briefcase. That's when I stopped being sad and started being dangerous. My father's funeral was on a Tuesday. By Friday, I had scheduled coffee with Martin Chen. Martin had been my father's first investor, back when Pierce Industries was just Jonathan Pierce and a dream in a garage. He'd made $40 million from that bet. More importantly, he would actually like my father, respected him. "Emma," he said when we met at a cafe far from anyone who knew us, "I'm so sorry. Your father was a good man." "He was," I said. "And Richard's destroying everything he built." I showed him the evidence. Not all of it, never show all your cards, but enough. The forged signatures, the suspicious transfers, the timeline that made no sense. Martin's face darkened. "What do you need?" "Investment capital. $2 million to start. I'll pay 7% interest, and you'll have it back in 3 years. He studied me for a long moment. "What's your plan?" "To build something Richard can't see coming, something that will be too big to stop by the time he notices." Martin pulled out his checkbook. "Your father once told me you had his instincts. Let's see if he was right." "But I'm not giving you $2 million. He wrote a number and slid it across the table. "I'm giving you 5, and I don't want interest. I want equity. $5 million. I started small. A consulting firm that helped mid-sized companies optimize their supply chains. Boring, technical, the kind of business Richard would never look at twice. I hired 3 people. A logistics expert Richard had fired for asking too many questions. A data analyst who had left Pierce Industries after Richard slashed the research budget. And my father's former assistant who'd been let go the day after the funeral. They all had one thing in common. They hated Richard. We worked out of a co-working space. No fancy office, no company cars, Nothing that would attract attention, just results. Within 6 months, we'd landed contracts with 4 of Pierce Industries' suppliers. Not competing directly. Richard would have noticed that. Just becoming essential to companies he depended on, learning their pressure points, building relationships. The consulting firm generated enough profit to start the next phase. A private equity fund, small and specialized. We targeted struggling companies in sectors Richard was expanding into, bought them for pennies, restructured them, made them profitable. Richard thought he was competing with various random players in the market. He never realized they were all me. My father's old contacts came out of the woodwork. They'd all heard whispers about Richard's takeover. Some had seen the forged will. Others just knew my father would never have left me with nothing. They didn't offer charity. These were business people, but they offered deals. Fair ones. The kind you give someone you believe in. By year 2, my companies were worth $40 million. By year 3, $80 million. And Richard still thought I was living off that $50,000, probably working some entry-level job, too heartbroken to matter. He had no idea his little niece owned pieces of his entire supply chain. He had no idea I was already inside his walls. And the best part, I was just getting started. The first crack appeared in Richard's empire on a Tuesday morning in March. I was in my real office, by then a modest suite, in a building Richard had never heard of, when my data analyst, Jennifer, knocked on my door with a laptop and a smile. He just signed the contract, she said. The contract was for Industrial Plastics, a key component in Pierce Industries' manufacturing division. Richard's previous supplier had mysteriously raised their prices by 30% last month. A new company, one of mine, though the ownership was buried under 3 shell corporations, had offered him the same product for 20% less than his old rate. Of course he would have signed. Richard always chose the cheapest option, even when it gave someone else leverage. Now I controlled his supply, and the contract had clauses. Lovely, legal clauses about delivery schedules, and quality standards and penalty fees that I'd written myself. Phase 1 complete, Jennifer said. Over the next 6 months, the cracks spread like fractures in ice. Richard's real estate investments started hemorrhaging money. Tenants left mysteriously, lured away by better deals from landlords who happened to be in my network. His tech startups lost key employees to companies I'd quietly acquired. His import-export business faced unexpected regulatory complications that I'd carefully engineered through perfectly legal channels. Nothing massive, nothing obvious, just death by 1,000 cuts. I watched from a distance as Richard started making mistakes. Stressed people always do. He took on debt to cover shortfalls. He made aggressive expansion moves to offset losses. He started fighting battles on multiple fronts, never realizing it was all one front. All me. Pierce Industries stock dropped 3 points today, my CFO mentioned during a meeting. Market analysts are calling it a correction. It wasn't a correction. It was me, slowly squeezing. Richard called an emergency board meeting, started demanding explanations, fired 2 executives, made dramatic speeches about refocusing the company vision. My father's old assistant, who still had friends inside Pierce Industries, forwarded me the internal memo. I read Richard's words about temporary setbacks and market fluctuations and maintaining confidence. He still didn't see it, even as his empire started crumbling. Even as problems multiplied around him like shadows at sunset, Richard Pierce had no idea he was fighting a ghost. The ghost of a daughter he'd dismissed. The ghost he'd created when he stole my father's company. And ghosts, I'd learned, are very hard to kill. Year 4 was when I stopped being patient and started being ruthless. Richard had taken out loans to cover his losses. Substantial loans. Banks loved lending to Pierce Industries. It was a legacy company with decades of history. What they didn't know was that the company was bleeding from wounds they couldn't see. I knew about the loans before Richard's own CFO did. One of my first hires had been a banking analyst who specialized in corporate debt. She had contacts everywhere. Morgan Stanley just approved $15 million, she told me over secure video chat. Deutsche Bank is considering another 20. He's leveraging everything. Buy the debt, I said. She blinked. That's aggressive. That's necessary. Use the Singapore fund. Layer it through the usual channels. Within 2 months, I owned 40% of Richard's corporate debt through a maze of shell companies that would take forensic accountants years to untangle. Richard thought he owed money to international investment firms. He had no idea his niece held the leash. But debt was just the beginning. Richard owned a commercial property portfolio worth roughly $60 million. Office buildings, retail spaces, parking structures, all financed with variable rate mortgages he'd taken out during the boom years. When interest rates started climbing, his margins got thinner. I waited until he was desperate, then struck. My real estate acquisition company, officially owned by a Hong Kong corporation that was actually owned by a Cayman Islands trust that I controlled, made an offer on his flagship property. A downtown office tower, 30 stories, prime location. The offer was fair. Not generous, but fair. Richard was too proud to accept. I withdrew the offer and waited. 2 weeks later, 3 of his major tenants didn't renew their leases. Tenants I'd quietly helped relocate to better buildings I owned. Richard's tower went from 70% occupied to 40% overnight. The mortgage payments stayed the same. The revenue dropped by half. My company made another offer, lower this time. He still refused. I bought the company that serviced his elevators. Suddenly, maintenance costs tripled. Building code inspectors, legitimate ones, I didn't need to break laws, found violations that required expensive fixes. His insurance premiums skyrocketed after a random audit. The third offer was half the second. Richard sold. He had no choice. I repeated this strategy across his entire portfolio. Buy the debt, pressure the assets, make cash offers when he was desperate. It was like playing chess against someone who couldn't see the board. By the end of year 4, I owned 60% of Richard's real estate portfolio and 70% of his corporate debt. I controlled his supply chains, employed his former staff, and had positioned myself at every critical juncture of his business empire. The Pierce Industries stock price had dropped 40% from its peak. Richard's personal net worth had evaporated by $100 million. And at a charity gala where we crossed paths, he looked through me like I was invisible, never suspecting the quiet woman in the simple black dress held a knife to his throat. I smiled at him that night. He smiled back, distracted, already moving on to more important people. 6 months later, I'd destroy him, and he still wouldn't see me coming. The call came on a Wednesday morning. Richard's assistant, sounding panicked, asking if I could attend an emergency family meeting that afternoon. "You!" Richard's voice came out as a rasp. "This is impossible, is it?" I advanced to the next slide. A timeline appeared starting 5 years ago. "Let me walk you through it." I clicked. March 2019. "My father shows me evidence of your embezzlement. You've been stealing from him for 2 years at this point, setting up shell companies, forging his signature on transfer documents." Aunt Caroline gasped. "That's a lie, is it?" I pulled up a document. "This is your signature, Richard, on a transfer authorization dated January 2019. Except my father was in Tokyo that entire week. I have the hotel records, the flight manifests, and 3 witnesses who had dinner with him the night you supposedly met to discuss this transfer." Richard's face had gone gray. "May 2019, I continued. "My father has his stroke. You and a lawyer I'd never seen before go into his room. 30 minutes later, you emerge with a new will, conveniently signed while he was barely conscious." I clicked again. Security camera footage appeared, grainy but clear. Enough. Richard and the lawyer entering my father's hospital room, my father's hand being guided to sign documents he couldn't possibly read. "I got this from a nurse," I said. "She thought she was helping me preserve memories of my father's final days. She had no idea she was documenting fraud." Michelle stood up. "Dad, tell her this isn't true." But Richard couldn't speak. He was staring at the screen like it was his execution. "The will reading." I clicked to the next slide. $50,000 and some photographs. "While you got $87 million in assets and a $200 million company." I looked around the room. Did any of you question that? Did any of you think it was strange that Jonathan Pierce, who'd been grooming me to run his company since I was 12, would leave me nothing? Silence. "But I didn't contest the will," I continued, "because court cases are slow, expensive, public, and they only give you back what was stolen. I wanted more than that." The next slide showed my corporate structure. The web of companies, investments, and acquisitions, all flowing back to me. I spent 5 years building this, I said. Every company Richard thought was a random competitor, mine. Every supplier that raised prices, mine. Every tenant who mysteriously broke their lease, relocated to my buildings. Every debt he took out to cover his losses, I bought it. I pulled up the final calculation. The number was staggering. Pierce Industries is worth $40 million right now, down from $200 million 5 years ago. Richard's personal assets have dropped from $90 million to approximately $12 million. His debt load is $63 million. I paused, letting it sink in. I control all $63 million of that debt. I own 70% of his commercial real estate. I have controlling interest in every company he depends on. I looked directly at Richard. You didn't lose Pierce Industries in a hostile takeover, Uncle. You've been working for me for 3 years. You just didn't know it. David's voice cracked. What do you want? I closed my laptop. I want what my father wanted, justice. It's urgent, she said. Mr. Pierce specifically requested you be there. I let silence hang on the line, as if considering, as if I didn't already know exactly why Richard was panicking. Pierce Industries stock had crashed 15% overnight. A leveraged buyout attempt had failed spectacularly. 3 board members had resigned, and the banks were calling in their loans. I'll be there, I said quietly. I dressed carefully that afternoon. Not the designer clothes I could now afford, but something similar to what I'd worn to the will reading 5 years ago. Modest, forgettable. The daughter who'd been given $50,000 and faded into obscurity. The conference room was chaos when I arrived. Richard stood at the head of the table, his perfect silver hair disheveled for the first time I could remember. Aunt Caroline sat rigid in her chair, her Chanel suit unable to hide the fear in her eyes. My cousins David and Michelle whispered frantically in the corner. Emma, Richard said when he saw me, and the relief in his voice was almost pathetic. Thank God, we need family unity right now. I sat down without a word. I'll be direct, Richard continued, his voice shaking. The company is facing a hostile takeover. Multiple creditors are demanding immediate repayment. We're looking at potential bankruptcy if we can't secure emergency funding. He pulled up a presentation, number after number, showing the catastrophic state of Pierce Industries. Everything I'd orchestrated, laid out in red ink and declining graphs. I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, Richard said, looking directly at me. I know you felt your father's will was unfair, but you're still family, and I'm hoping, he swallowed hard, I'm hoping you might have some savings you could contribute. Even a small amount would help show the banks that the family has faith in the company. Aunt Caroline nodded eagerly. We'd pay you back, of course, with interest. David leaned forward. Emma, please, this is Dad's legacy, your father's legacy too. I let the silence stretch, let them see hope flickering, let them think the quiet, dismissed daughter might actually be their salvation. Then I opened my laptop. Before we discuss my contribution, I said softly, connecting to the room's display screen. I think there's something you should know. The screen flickered to life behind Richard, and I watched his face change as he saw the first slide. The shell company names, the debt ownership records, the property acquisitions, all leading back to one name, Emma Pierce. What is this? Richard whispered. I smiled. This is everything you took from me, and everything I took back. Richard found his voice finally, though it came out broken. You can't do this. I'll fight you in court. I'll expose everything. Expose what? I pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. Your embezzlement? Your fraud? The forged will? Please expose it. The FBI would be fascinated. He grabbed the folder with shaking hands. Inside were copies of everything. Every forged signature, every illegal transfer, every piece of evidence I'd spent 5 years collecting. That's your copy, I said. The SEC has another. So does the Justice Department. They've been very patient, waiting for my signal. Aunt. Caroline's pearls clicked as she slumped back. You're sending your own uncle to prison? I'm giving him a choice, I corrected. The same choice he gave my father. Sign papers, or lose everything. I placed a new document on the table. Richard stared at it like it might bite him. Option 1, I said. You resign immediately from Pierce Industries. Transfer all remaining shares to me. Cooperate fully with the authorities. In exchange, I'll advocate for reduced charges. You'll probably serve 2 to 3 years for fraud, but you'll keep some dignity. Option 2? Richard whispered. I bury you, I said simply. Full criminal prosecution. Civil suits from every investor you defrauded. Asset seizure. By the time the lawyers are done, you'll have nothing, not even your reputation. I stood up, smoothing my dress. There's also option 3. The room went silent. You work for me, I said. Pierce Industries needs restructuring. I need someone who knows the company inside and out. Entry-level position. $40,000 a year. You'll report to my VP of Operations, who used to be your assistant before you fired her. Richard's face went purple. You expect me to work for you? I expect you to earn back a fraction of what you stole, I replied. 20 years of honest work might not erase what you did, but it's a start. And unlike prison, you'd see your family occasionally. I picked up my bag. You have 48 hours to decide. After that, the FBI makes the decision for you. I walked to the door, then paused. Oh, and Richard? That $50,000 you left me? I turned it into $12 billion. Imagine what I could have done with a real inheritance. The door closed behind me on their stunned silence. Outside, my driver waited, and my empire waited. And somewhere, I hoped my father was smiling. My uncle took my inheritance thinking I was too young, too trusting, too broken to fight back. He was right about one thing. I was young, but I wasn't broken. I was patient. And patience, I learned, is the most expensive weapon you can own.